In 1887, a 23-year-old took over his father's newspaper, the San Francisco Examiner. Nothing about that sounds remarkable. Rich sons inherit newspapers all the time. What made this one different is what he did next. 9 years later, he was in Manhattan, and he did something publishers at the time considered reckless. He paid rival papers' best writers more money than they were making, just to take them off the board. He printed 16 pages in color when the technology barely existed. He built the loud, sensational, unmistakably American newspaper, the template you can still recognize on a newsstand today. And for a while that loudness had teeth. In 1908, his papers published the Standard Oil letters, exposing bribery, reaching into the United States Senate. It was muckraking journalism at its most fearless, and it made him a name that mattered in Washington, not just on newsstands. By 1922, he was standing at the very top of American media. 20 newspapers spread across 13 of the country's largest cities. 2 wire services feeding them stories. King Features supplying the comic strips that half the country read over Sunday breakfast. A scandal magazine, the American Weekly, selling in the millions. Ad magazines, a newsreel operation, and a film company, and you have something no single American had ever assembled before, and something no publisher after him would match either. There was exactly one thing all that power couldn't buy him. He ran for mayor of New York. He lost. He ran governor. He lost again. 2 unremarkable terms in Congress were the only elected office the public ever handed him. In 1922, a fellow power broker refused to run alongside him on a state ticket, and that was the moment it became undeniable. The presidency was never going to happen. So he turned around and did something almost as ambitious as running the country. He decided to build a private kingdom instead. That kingdom had a name, San Simeon, and the money to build it was about to come from somewhere it never should have. Part 2. The number he wrote down about himself. Here's what makes this story different from a simple rags to riches to rags arc. The businesses were never the problem. In 1936 alone, one of his magazines, Good Housekeeping, posted an operating profit of $3.8 million. The American Weekly had the best year of its entire existence that same year. Whatever was about to go wrong with this empire, it wasn't bad journalism, and it wasn't bad management of the actual product. Hold on to that because it's the whole riddle this story is built around. The trouble started quietly in 1924 with borrowing. Not measured, careful borrowing, the kind a growing company takes on with a plan to pay it back. Contemporary reporting described it as careless, his signature scrolled again and again as personal security against loan after loan. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should. He wasn't just borrowing as a businessman pledging his company's assets. He was personally guaranteeing corporate debt over and over in his own name. By 1930, banks had floated $60 million in bonds and mortgages, each one backed by William Randolph Hearst himself. In today's money, that's a little north of $1 billion resting on one man's signature. Then the stock market crashed, and like a lot of over-leveraged men in 1930, he needed cash. What he did next is the hinge the entire story turns on. He took 6 of his West Coast newspapers, against which he'd already borrowed $20 million, bundled them with 4 more profitable papers and the American Weekly, and packaged the whole thing into a brand new public company, Hearst Consolidated Publications. Now here's the part to slow down for. When it came time to put a dollar value on what new company actually owned, he didn't value the printing presses. He didn't value the delivery trucks or the office buildings. He valued something called goodwill, circulation, reputation, the strength of his own name in the marketplace. He priced that intangible idea at $75 million, close to $1.5 billion today, and then he sold $50 million of preferred stock to the public, backed by that number. Think about what that actually means. He wrote down a figure for how much his own reputation was worth, and then he sold shares against it to the public at a promised 7% dividend, marketed it as an ultra-conservative investment. About 50,000 ordinary Americans bought in. Schoolteachers, shopkeepers, widows with a little savings and a lot of trust in a famous name on a stock certificate. For 7.5 straight years, it worked exactly the way he'd promised. The dividend arrived, quarter after quarter, right on schedule. But underneath that steady payout, something very different was happening, and almost nobody outside the company could see it. Part 3. The money moving the wrong way. While 50,000 small investors collected their 7% like clockwork, Hearst was pulling more than $12 million out of that same company in common stock dividends. Dividends that flowed to him personally, not to the public shareholders. Meanwhile, the newspapers the public now partly owned were paying $2 million a year to King Features for comics and columns. King Features belonged to Hearst alone, through a separate company the public had no stake in whatsoever. So the public's money was funding payments back into his private pocket every single year, just for the funny pages. Then, in 1935, it got stranger. He sold 3 of his own newspapers, in Baltimore, Atlanta, and San Antonio, to the public company for $8 million. $6 million of that $8 million was, when, priced as goodwill. Those same 3 papers had lost $550,000 the year before. He sold the public his own money-losing newspapers and charged them millions extra for the privilege of owning his name. For 7 years, none of this was visible to the 50,000 people holding the stock. Then, in the spring of 1937, Hearst needed to borrow again, and this time federal law forced the books open. To raise new money, his companies had to register with the Securities and Exchange Commission, and a registration statement, unlike a press release, doesn't care whose name is on the building. It just reports the numbers. 250 pages went to Washington. Almost nobody read them closely. Two did, and what they found would end this entire arrangement. Part 4. The books nobody was supposed to see. A subsidiary of the public company reported total assets of $89 million, about $2 billion today. Of that $89 million, $75 million was either goodwill or money simply owed to it by its own parent company. Do the subtraction. Only $14 million of that company's assets were anything close to real. It got stranger the deeper you looked. The single largest tangible asset on the books was a $37 million debt, owed to the subsidiary by its own parent. And the reason the parent owed that money was almost circular. When the public company was formed in 1930, part of what it used to buy the subsidiary's stock was debt the subsidiary itself had extended. In plain terms, the subsidiary had effectively lent the parent company the money it used to buy the subsidiary. Contemporary financial reporters called it exactly what it was: a structure held together by companies owing each other paper, not cash. The filings also showed bank loans guaranteed 3 separate times over, by the parent company, by the company above that, and by Hearst personally, all stacked on the same debt. They showed a Manhattan office building sold from one Hearst company to another for $500,000 more than its appraised value. They showed that most of the empire's insurance business ran through an agency Hearst himself owned 40% of. And buried in there was St. Donats, a 135-room castle in Wales that had bought in 1925 without ever seeing it in person. Its enormous upkeep quietly run through the books of a British magazine company as an ordinary business expense. Tucked inside the loan agreement covering it was a small telling clause. The company could maintain St. Donats for him. It could not spend a single dollar improving it. His own lenders had already started fencing him off from his own toys, 2 full years before anything visibly broke. Strip away all the language, and one pattern repeats through every one of these deals. Write up a number for what your own name is worth. Borrow against that number, and when the bill comes due, write up another number to cover it. By March of 1937, he needed $35.5 million more, and this time the machine finally jammed. Part 5. 2 men nobody had heard of. 2 relatively unknown figures. A New York City civil service commissioner named Paul Kern and an accountant named Bernard Rice read through the new registration filings and formally objected, arguing they were misleading to the public. Hearst delayed the offering. Then, again, the SEC never even got the chance to formally rule. A refinancing scheme that had survived a market crash, a depression, and years of increasingly aggressive borrowing was stopped cold by a filed objection from 2 men most Americans have never heard of, before or since. And a machine that only survives by borrowing new money to pay off old debt cannot simply pause. It has to keep moving or it stops entirely. In June of 1937, hounded by creditors on every side, Hearst boarded a train to New York to meet a lawyer named Clarence Shern, a man who had represented him decades earlier, back when Hearst was still the young reformer exposing Standard Oil. But by 1937, Shern had also recently served as trial counsel for Chase National Bank, Hearst's single largest creditor. Whatever that meeting, it wasn't a negotiation between equals. It was a man walking into a room where the bank had already picked out a chair. On June 23rd, his most beloved paper, the New York American, closed its doors for good. 4 days later, on June 27th, Hearst signed the document that ended his control. What his own lawyer told him afterward is the coldest sentence in the entire story. From now on, Hearst would live on whatever allowance his creditors decided he could have. The richest publisher in America had just become an employee of his own company. Part 6. Selling the empire, piece by piece. The dismantling started immediately, and it started with him. His salary dropped from $500,000 a year to $100,000. In today's terms, from roughly 11 million down to 2. 7 radio stations were sold for just over $1 million. Papers in Rochester and Omaha were shut down entirely. The Washington Times was leased away. 2 of his wire services were merged into one, just to save close to $5 million in overhead. Bondholders holding debt against his real estate were offered a choice: accept a lower interest rate or take the physical buildings. They took the Ritz Tower, the very building where Hearst lived whenever he was in Manhattan. In 1935, contemporary reporting had valued the entire Hearst empire at $200 million, close to $5 billion today, with a note attached that the estimate was, if anything, generous. By 1939, that same reporting placed the true value at only a fraction of that figure. Nobody, including the men holding the actual paper, had ever really known what the empire was worth, because so much of its stated value had only ever existed as a number Hearst wrote about himself. Out in California, his own castle at San Simeon sat mortgaged for $600,000, held by Harry Chandler, owner of the Los Angeles Times, his direct newspaper rival. In February of 1939, Chandler agreed to extend the loan rather than force a public embarrassment. Hearst didn't make that call himself. He couldn't. Someone else had to ask on his behalf. And then came for the art. Part 7. A Monastery that was never unpacked. Across 47 years of collecting, Hearst had spent an estimated $30 million on art and antiquities for objects contemporary appraisers believed were worth closer to $15 million. That's roughly $800 million today, spent on collections worth less than half that. There was no complete catalogue of the collection anywhere except in his own memory. It filled 5 separate warehouses. In one building in the Bronx, alongside suits of armor and Egyptian artifacts, sat an entire 12th century Spanish monastery, bought whole, disassembled stone by stone, and packed into 10,000 crates. He had purchased a monastery and never once unpacked it. In March of 1938, at nearly 75 years old, Hearst agreed to sell off at least 2/3 of everything he owned. A Manhattan art dealer spent 3 months just trying to catalog it all. By 1939, pieces from that collection had sold for under $709,000 combined. By 1941, what remained went on sale on the 5th floor of Gimbel's department store in Manhattan, one of the great private art collections in American history, liquidated to whoever happened to walk in off the sidewalk. Up on the hill, the work on San Simeon simply stopped. According to the castle's own curator, the grand ballroom, meant to finally join its 2 wings into one complete building, was never constructed. Entire guest cottages existed only as architectural drawings and stayed that way. The total spent on the estate across 28 years came in under $10 million, a fraction of what popular imagination assumes, because Hearst had drawn the money out through his companies as he went, with no single clean record of the total. Even Broadway noticed. A popular entertainer of the day performed a comic number, joking that he'd only buy a paper from Hearst if Hearst would buy a pencil from him. But the worst year hadn't even arrived yet. Part 8. The 4 Dividends. Every publisher in America had a difficult 1938. The difference is that most of them had some slack to absorb it. Hearst, none left. The price of newsprint rose from $42.50 a ton to $50, adding roughly $5 million to what his papers owed the paper mills. Advertising revenue across the chain fell 25%, about $10 million simply gone. Circulation fell right alongside it, from just over 5.1 million daily readers in 1936 to about 4.4 million 2 years later. Close to 800,000 readers walked away in 24 months. In June of 1938, Hearst consolidated. The very company built on that $75 million valuation of his own name missed its dividend payment for the first time. Remember exactly who that dividend belonged to: 50,000 ordinary people who had been sold an ultra-conservative investment on the strength of a famous man's word. The company, again and again. Buried inside the original stock agreement was a protection clause almost nobody had thought about in years. If Hearst consolidated, missed 4 consecutive dividend payments, control of Hearst's best newspaper properties would pass directly out of his organization and into the hands of the stockholders themselves. By March of 1939, 3 payments had already been missed. Arrears stood at $2.625 million. The 4th payment, $875,000, was due on the 15th. A stockholders' committee had already gathered 30,000 shares worth of proxies, ready to install an entirely new board the moment that 4th payment failed. 4 separate shareholder lawsuits were already active. The board of directors had to decide that week whether to find the money or let the empire slip out of Hearst's hands entirely. And the president of the company, the man whose name was on everything, wasn't in the room. He wasn't even in the same city. William Randolph Hearst was 3,000 miles away at Marion Davies' beach house in Santa Monica, while a decision that would determine whether he still had an empire was made without him. Paid the dividend. By that margin alone, papers stayed his. Part 9. What survived and why. Look at the market's honest verdict that same week. Preferred stock, originally sold at $25 a share, was trading at $6.25. Bonds with a face value of $1,000 were changing hands for $535. Both instruments had been sold to the public on the strength of one man's name, and were now worth roughly half of what buyers had paid, or less. Not one of those 50,000 investors had done anything wrong. They had simply believed a famous man's word about the value of his own name. And yet, look at what Hearst still held in 1939, after 2 brutal years of a stranger dismantling his life's work. 3 radio stations, 12 magazines, 20 daily newspapers, 15 Sunday papers, a scandal magazine, a features syndicate, a wire service, and half of a film company. 20 newspapers. The exact same number he'd owned back in 1922. It's an almost eerie coincidence, and it hides the real story completely, because 6 papers had been bought in the years between, and 6 others had been sold or shuttered since the crisis began. The count came out level. What was underneath it did not. There's one more figure that belongs here, and it's the only one in this entire story that came from affection rather than arithmetic. In the middle of the worst of it, the actress Marion Davies gave Hearst $1 million of her own money to help hold the empire together. The turnaround that followed didn't come from Hearst regaining control. It came from him losing it to people who were finally allowed to say no. Shern built a management team from Hearst's own longtime executives, and when the first year of recovery wasn't fast enough, promoted his features chief to run the entire newspaper chain. He told individual publishers to cut wasteful promotions, raise prices where the market allowed, and make every single paper justify its own existence. For the first time in the company's history, local publishers were given real autonomy. You can see exactly how much that autonomy mattered in 1939, when Hearst personally ordered his papers to frame a French military movement in East Africa as an act of war against Italy. Not one of his papers ran the story that way. The man was still there. The empire had simply stopped being an extension of his will, and that, more than anything else, is the reason it survived. Then the Second World War arrived, and advertising and circulation recovered along with the wider economy. By the mid-1940s, the company was stable again. The original trusteeship agreement had an end date built into it, 1947, when Hearst would turn 84. Nobody, including Hearst himself, knew for certain he'd live to see it. He did. Part 10. The finished sentence. So here's the answer to the question we opened with. How does a man lose control of everything he owns and still die rich? He should have lost everything. He never did, for one cold, unsentimental reason. Letting him collapse was more expensive for his creditors than propping him up. A forced liquidation in 1938 would have meant dumping 20 newspapers into a Depression-era market with almost no buyers. Keeping him alive and squeezing him slowly was worth more to the banks than shutting him down. And there's a second reason, maybe the more important one. Nearly all of the underlying Hearst businesses were profitable the entire time this was happening. What nearly destroyed them wasn't bad journalism, bad readers, or even the Depression, which his competitors survived just fine. What nearly destroyed them was debt the owner strapped to their backs, personally, year after year, in his own signature. In the film Citizen Kane, the fictional publisher dies alone in a half-finished, decaying palace, and the fortune dies right along with him. It's a brilliant film, and it's the reason the ruined version of this story is the one that stuck in the popular imagination. William Randolph Hearst died in 1951, and his newspapers were still printing when he did. He never lost the fortune. He lost the vote. And the distance between those two things is the entire story of what happened to him between 1937 and 1939. More than 70 years later, the company built from those same properties is still private, still intact, and still controlled by the family trust that carries his name. Closing, the Unbuilt Ballroom. Up on the hill at San Simeon, the grand ballroom meant to finally join north and south wings of the castle was never built. The north wing still stops partway up, exactly where the money ran out. The drawings for the last 2 guest cottages are still just drawings, sitting in an archive somewhere. Hearst went back to San Simeon one final time in May of 1947 and left the house exactly the way the crisis had left it. A sentence that stopped in the middle and never got its ending. He, rich. The castle never got finished. Those, same fact. And that fact leaves behind an uncomfortable lesson, one that has almost nothing to do with newspapers. The man who cannot say no to you should never be the person guarding your money. Hearst didn't have anyone like that. Not for 13 years. Not until a lawyer with no emotional stake in a castle was finally allowed to refuse him. It's the same lawyer who took the empire away from him in the first place, and it's the reason there's still an empire to talk about at all. Some family fortunes don't disappear because the business failed. They nearly disappear because nobody in the room was willing to say no to the man who built it. That's a pattern that shows up again and again in the history of American wealth, sometimes with a very different ending. Next time, we're going to look at a fortune where nobody stepped in to say no, and where, unlike this one, that silence was the whole story.